Welcome to the Point. This week we look both back and ahead to a year of remembrance and celebration of a very special 50th anniversary. Talking with Gleaves Whitney, you are the chairman of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. You are the executive director, I think is the more appropriate title. First of all, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rick.
This is kind of an exciting time because over the course of the next year, we're going to be looking back, but looking ahead at what was the remarkable ascension to the presidency of Gerald R. Ford. And before we get there, let's get a little background on you, because I was telling you before we came in here, I've known you since virtually the moment I arrived in Michigan 28 years ago. But you have been involved in so many different levels of politics, the history of politics, presidential studies, and now from the Ford Foundation. Tell me a little bit about your background, because for those of us who know you, we know, but for those who don't, they don't. So tell me a little bit about Gleaves.
Well, in brief, I was really fortunate to come to Michigan because of the University of Michigan. I had the opportunity to go to grad school there in Ann Arbor, and I was working on a PhD in history. I got a call one day from the Engler administration. And the Engler administration invited me to come down and talk to them about writing speeches for Governor Engler. And I thought, this will be a great opportunity now to get on the other side of history. You know, instead of working in the archives and seeing the decisions as they come out, what about the input side of history? So I switched career paths, ended up with John Engler for almost a dozen years. Really profited from the experience in so many ways. It deepened my understanding of the way the world works. And John Engler was a great guy to work for. And then after that, I had the opportunity to come to Grand Rapids and become a Grand Rapidian when the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies was looking for its first full-time director. And I had the privilege of working with Ralph Hauenstein until 2016.
Who is another treasure we should discuss on another show. But I want to talk about what we're looking at this year, because in August of 2024, it will mark 50 years since Jerry Ford became president. That's remarkable to me to think about, and lets me recognize I'm older than I wish, because I remember all of those things pretty clearly. But it really started back in June of 1972 with the break-in at the Watergate Hotel. I would suggest that all of this started perhaps even earlier than this, with some of the dirty tricks that were played by CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, including the famous instance with Ed Muskie, where there was a letter that suggested he use a very unkind phrase to describe Canadians, and led him to ultimately get out of that race for president. Some of the things that happened during that cycle are still perplexing to me for a president who was in office and appeared to be a shoo-in for re-election. Was Watergate and some of that an outcropping of just the general mindset of that administration?
Well, I think starting in 1972, which is where you pegged the beginning of your discussion, is absolutely critical to the whole ascent of Gerald Ford, because when Watergate starts to unravel for Nixon, so June 17th, 1972, and then by about June 22nd, it's all over the Washington Post. So you have a dynamic that's set in motion that's going to change the politics of the administration, of the Republican Party, of the Democratic Party, and all of the Democrats who are going to be the Watergate babies who are going to be elected. So you have this massive, you know, you don't want to use too many cliches, but it is a tectonic change in American history. But prior to that, so many Americans had this faith in the federal government. They believed that after World War II, after the Great Depression, World War II, the 30s and the 40s, you look at a federal government that's able to provide and respond in ways that really meet human need, whether it's defending our borders or providing relief from a terrible depression. There was generally 80–90% trust in government. And by the 60s, you know, the race riots, the Vietnam War, and then scandal within government itself at the highest levels, where President Nixon is found guilty eventually of cover-up. And by 1974, it's clear that he will not be able to sustain his time in office because the House of Representatives has begun to initiate impeachment inquiry and articles of impeachment. So when you add up all of that, Rick, you really have a sea change in Americans' view of government. And this, of course, is foundational to your profession, the press's view, from Daniel Ellsberg and the break-in of the psychologist's office to get the Ellsberg papers. The New York Times publishes that. Oh my gosh, things are changing so fast. And Americans are in a crisis. They're wounded. Their country is wounded. So President Ford is the ideal candidate to come along. Now, there had been a lot of names floated for potential higher office. President Ford had even, I think, showed some interest, perhaps, in leaving the House, but none of that ever really went anywhere. It was in 1973, October 12th, when you had Spiro Agnew have to resign in disgrace.
Let's talk about that for just a moment,
Yeah.
because this is a separate track entirely, or at least we believe it to be. I remember at the time there were those who were conspiratorial that thought that somehow Agnew was going to be a scapegoat, but in fact, Agnew ended up resigning because of alleged and later convicted misdoings while in Maryland. He was governor. He was also a county official then. So he ended up resigning, not because of Watergate, but because of tax evasion, that he ultimately made a deal, pled guilty to one count so he wouldn't serve jail time. But let's remember who he was. He was the White House bulldog when it came to going out, defending the president, and actually going after the press. Now, when we say going after the press, it looked nothing like what it does today. He was tame in comparison, but he was famous for great sayings, and here's one of them. Quote, "In the United States today, we have more than our share of the nattering nabobs of negativism. They have formed their own 4-H club, the hopeless, hysterical hypochondriacs of history." That was the kind of stuff we got from Spiro Agnew. He was an interesting case, and his resignation led to, as you just discussed, the incoming of Gerald R. Ford, December 6th of 1973, when he was sworn in. But before that happened, Gerald Ford had been asked to go around and talk to members and get names of people who might be good candidates for vice president. In fact, his tally card for a long time was displayed over at the Ford Museum. And there were names on there we know, a guy named Ronald Reagan, a guy named Nelson Rockefeller, and others, George Herbert Walker Bush. But when he turned that card back into President Nixon, whose name was at the top of the list with the most votes?
Well, this is President Ford, or then Congressman, or House Minority Leader Ford,
Right.
had worked his way up since he was first elected from West Michigan in the 5th Congressional District in those days, and he won every re-election, and he gained this reputation in Congress of being a straight shooter, always telling the truth, even when the truth was hard to tell, but also having the capacity to assert himself when it came to ambition. And when he felt that the Republicans took too big of a beating in 1964, for example, after the Kennedy assassination. And Johnson, of course, is using the country's grieving as a way to bring the country together, and Democrats come together and just wallop.
And Barry Goldwater being kind of an outlier
That's
in
right.
the party at that time.
Absolutely. And so Ford looked at those election losses. And the reason I'm laying this groundwork is that a lot of people look at Ford and they say, oh, good old Jerry, he's just such a nice guy. Well, he also had a toughness inside him and a competitiveness. Remember, this was an all-American center at the University of Michigan, football, national championship teams. He knew how to compete. It was part of his DNA. And while he didn't have a speechwriter like Pat Buchanan the way Spiro Agnew did, he did have this inner drive to serve his country, and where he saw problems and faults to try to correct them. So Ford, of course, surfaces to the top because he's trusted on both sides of the aisle, because the Democrats know, even though President Ford is a lifelong Republican, the Democrats know that they'll be able to work with him in good faith. That was key at this time when there was so much trust in government that was eroding. So then House Minority Leader Ford is advanced on October 15th, 1973, and then by December 6th, as you say, both the House and the Senate vote to make him vice president.
Our conversation continues with a surprise revelation about Congressman Ford's prior knowledge of an important development at this pivotal moment in our country's political landscape. Next, To the Point. Welcome back to The Point. We continue our conversation with the executive director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, Gleaves Whitney. I'm going to take a sidetrack, and we're here to talk about what the foundation is going to do to celebrate these 50 years, but I think it's important to lay the background for those of us who lived it and have studied it to some degree, because this was something the likes of we have never seen since, had never seen before. And so when you think about how this all came about, there was a curveball that I received this past summer. Richard Norton Smith released a new book, and in that book, and I should say he's a highly respected presidential historian, author, has done much work along a number of presidents, particularly President Ford. But he suggested in that book that then Minority Leader Ford, well prior to Spiro Agnew resigning, was aware that he had legal trouble. And that legal trouble was something that in some way was going to impact him. He was going to be responsible for. So it appears that he may have had a bit of a heads up, and he may have been preparing this because for the aw shucks politician that he sometimes pretended to be, he was anything but.
There are two instances of this happening where House Minority Leader Ford gets wind that his name is going to be floated and that he should prepare his staff, himself, and also his most trusted advisors for an eventual transition, a major transition. This happened not only on the way to the vice presidency, but to the presidency. Richard Norton Smith, we should say, he lives here in Grand Rapids. I would say he's arguably the finest presidential biographer living today in the United States. I mean, and he deserves those kudos. He works so hard. For example, in the book that we're referring to, Rick, he interviewed 160 people, some of the most interesting people who had not been interviewed before, and he found out things about President Ford and his background that nobody had known, not even the family. The 4 kids didn't even know these things about their father. So Richard's book is a great read, and by the way, if I may give a little commercial for it, the Wall Street Journal, so mid-December, basically in its weekend spread, the Wall Street Journal said it was one of the top 10 books of 2023. So Richard's book's getting a lot of the accolades and the attention that both Richard and President Ford and Mrs. Ford deserve. So President Ford, it turns out, this ambition, which when he after Bartle Yonkman, back in 1948, President Ford wasn't, Jerry Ford wasn't just sitting and waiting for, I'll just wait till my turn to run for public office. He took on an entrenched incumbent who was part of the McKay machine here. And then in '65, after the whipping the Republicans took, in '64, Ford looked around and he said, we need more energetic leadership in the House. And so he went after Charlie Halleck, and he became House Minority Leader. And so when he's teed up in '73 to advance to the vice presidency, he is prepared. And I think part of the thing that you can say about Ford is when he is investigated. Now let's put it this way. Let me just make a big universal statement before I make my more specific statement. If you look at President and Mrs. Ford, what would you say, 100 years of public service between them? Him and all those years, and then Mrs. Ford, during, the vice presidency, presidency, and post-presidency. During that 100 years of public service collectively, you have brokenness, you have depression, you have addiction, you have frustration, you have defeat, but not one scandal. People tried to attach scandal to President Ford on several occasions, but it never panned out because there wasn't any. So in Jerry Ford, you had somebody who was enormously attractive on both sides of the aisle. This guy is not going to bring baggage of scandal with him. Lyndon Johnson had been, saddled with scandal. John F. Kennedy, insiders knew there was lots of scandal there. And then, of course, Nixon with Watergate. So it was imperative for the country at that time to have a Gerald Ford who did not come with scandal, and a wife who did not come with scandal either.
Parenthetically, one of the reasons that Gerald Ford, in my opinion, became the choice was not only because he came back and said, look, here's who the House can vote for, but because many members who had to vote for him, 97-3, he told me, I think, in the Senate.
That's right.
Knew, or at least thought very seriously, that they were selecting the next president of the United States. I mean, this was not lost on them.
That's exactly right, Rick. They understood that Nixon was in a nosedive. And already, I mean, let's remember that we're talking about October to December of 1973, And by the following August 8th, Nixon's on TV. We all remember that date. It's one of those dates that lives in infamy for us and that is in our memories, where Nixon gets on the TV and says, "Tomorrow I am resigning."
Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president.
But again, it's because he had lost the support even of Republicans in the House. He lost Jerry Ford's support. President Ford, Vice President Ford, had been so loyal to Richard Nixon. They had been friends. Gosh, if you go back to the 1960, I think it was the 1960 campaign against John F. Kennedy, Minority Leader, or I should say, Congressman Ford, invites Nixon to come to Grand Rapids, and they meet right over here, by the main plaza downtown. Ford reports that 100,000 people showed up for Nixon Ford. And that was an amazing moment where Congressman Ford's able to introduce the president of the party and the nation, vice president who's going to be running for president, and there's that kind of support. And Nixon wanted Jerry to be at his side because Jerry had the integrity. For whatever dark past Nixon had, and some of the accusations that had been thrown at him, even in the vice presidency.
Oh, it goes way back, yeah.
Goes way back. So Ford was always a credit to whomever he attached.
The next few minutes is why I invited you here in the first place, but I had to get all of that to get there. We have already celebrated in terms of doing a relatively lengthy piece about Congressman who becomes vice president. As the foundation looks ahead to this next year, I know you're looking forward to doing some special things to remind people about a remarkable time in history. Tell me what you can about some of the things you have on tap.
We're entering such an exciting time. We're entering a series of rolling 50th anniversaries at the Ford Foundation, Museum, and Library. And I would commend the museum to anybody here in West Michigan. Go and familiarize yourself with who President and Mrs. Ford were, or President Ford. If you're just one of those geeks into politics, you'll learn a lot about what was going on in the 60s, 70s, and afterwards. President Ford, I've already mentioned his unimpeachable character. I mean, this is a man who had no scandal attached to him, but he really was a good man. We emphasize at the Ford that President Ford himself had mastered virtues. This goes back to his parents, his mother, Dorothy, his stepfather, Gerald Ford Sr. They had emphasized that a good life is a virtuous life, and you cannot be happy if you are not virtuous. If you have a bad conscience, you're troubled by your conscience. So you've got to be virtuous to be happy. Ford understood that at an early age. He was quite religious. His mother was especially religious, and he practiced those virtues, and he believed in service. This is something that he just seemed to be born with. Every step of the way, he believed in serving the greater good of his countrymen, and when called on to lead the free world, the whole free world. So President Ford had this constellation of personality traits that we celebrate. And we see that the celebration is so resonating with people today, whether it's the 4th or the 5th grader who comes into the DeVos Learning Center, or the retiree who comes at the other end of the life spectrum and comes in to experience the museum. And they see that even written into the museum walls, I mean literally written into the walls, are the virtues. So you'll see hardworking, team player, integrity, courage. These are written into the walls of our museum. And it's remarkable how hungry people are. So that's the background to our 50th anniversary. A good man, a good couple in Jerry and Betty Ford. So what we want to do is we want to highlight both of them in this next year. People forget that not only did President Ford become famous in 1974 on August 9th when he becomes president, but Mrs. Ford was also going to become famous because of what happened on September 26th of 1974.
Short period after he had taken office.
6 weeks later, she is diagnosed with breast cancer, and over the next 3 days, then she has to go into the hospital and have the operation. And it was a traumatic experience. But to her everlasting credit, she came out of that operation saying, I did not seek to have center stage as First Lady, but I have this incredible platform, and I'm going to talk to the women of America. And I was like, go get your mammogram. Do what you have to do to take care of your health, and make sure that the doctors are working with you directly and not going through your husband, because the little miss can't take the emotional impact of a bad diagnosis. Rick, that was the norm back in the 1970s.
Well, and you didn't say the words breast cancer.
You did not say them even at the dinner table.
Right.
It was considered kind of touchy and maybe rude, too forward. So Mrs. Ford, I always ask the question, how many lives, women's lives, did Mrs. Ford save? And then when you also add in the addiction issue, which had started in 1964, we've been talking about the early mid-60s, well, that was important also because she became, through no fault of her own, the doctor prescribed pills because she was trying to raise a window in their house in Alexandria, and she injured her back and nothing was working, so the doctor finally prescribed some pills. She became dependent on the pill-alcohol connection, and when it was time for her to fess up to this, she did so with great courage, and she made possible for interventions to happen in American families. If the Fords could have a family intervention to address Mrs. Ford's addiction, any family could. So if you combine the women's health with the addiction issues, I always ask the audiences out there, and when they come to the museum, I say, I want you to pause at the Betty Ford exhibit here. She's great in her own right. How many people did she save? How are our how are her lives different? Our health different today because of her?
And one of the other things, and we're running short on time, but one of the other things that should be mentioned is she and President Ford were an inseparable couple. They worked together, they labored together, they campaigned together, but she was not at all afraid to have very different views about the big issues of that time, and some of them remain the big issues of this time. And the president, as best we can tell, not once said, hey, don't do that. It'd be better for my presidency if you don't talk about it. I was involved in a wonderful project last year where it related some of the conversations that the president had with some of his advisors, and he essentially said, hey, if you don't want her to talk, you go tell her.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
And it shows the respect they had for each other. So if you look at Mrs. Ford's achievement with regard to women's health and then family addiction and also the Equal Rights Amendment and how she empowered women to go out and fight for your rights and what you believe in through the ERA. And then fourth, I always point out that President and Mrs. Ford, just what you're saying, they formed a polarity. You know, he was kind of stodgy and conservative in his personal habits, fiscal conservative though in policy. She was more liberal, more loose, fun-loving, and so they formed this polarity that very much mirrors the polarity of the American people: conservative, liberal, fiscally conservative, more generous or liberal in your approach to things. And I think that polarity so symbolizes, they were in a marriage, and we all know that marriages are tough. You have to get up every day and say, okay, yesterday I wasn't at my best, but today we can do better. And that's the way the Fords were, and that's a metaphor for us today. We can do better than what we see today.
I could do this for the next hour. We don't have that ability, but there'll be a lot to know. If people want to know what's going on at the museum, with the foundation, at the library, where's a clearinghouse that they can get to on the web?
Go to Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, GeraldRFordFoundation.org, and you'll see all of our upcoming events. You'll see all the things we've got planned for the 50th anniversary of President Ford going into the White House, and it's a wonderfully educational experience.
Gleaves Whitney, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Rick.
In the coming year, there'll be many milestones celebrated by the Ford Foundation Museum and Library. We, too, will highlight some of the moments that culminated with Gerald Ford becoming President of the United States in 1974. But the historic first did not end there. From a revealed diagnosis that changed the public discourse to a pardon that reverberated around the country. We'll talk about it all in the coming year. To the Point.